This and every episode of the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, a member-driven organization that wants to help you save money on beer and brewing supplies. In addition to providing brewing resources and hosting one-of-a-kind events, the AHA offers money-saving discounts at nearly 2,000 beery destinations around the country through their Member Deals program. Join the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org and make your beer money go further. Beer is the delicious amalgam of four main ingredients: water, hops, yeast, and of course malt, which I tend to view as being the canvas upon which all those other ingredients are painted, imparting flavors ranging from white bread to coffee and everything in between. This is the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, contributor Matt Del Fiacco and I will be focusing specifically on base malts. What's up, Matt?
Going well. How's it going with you, man?
Not bad. I'll tell you what, man. I'm a little worse for the wear this morning. Had a very wholesome shindig at my place last night, kind of breaking in this new pool, and none of us swam. It was cold and windy, but we did get a piñata, and along with piñatas usually comes a fair amount of drinking. So I'm right there with you, Marshall. I actually retook my BJCP exam yesterday. Down at Hopvine Brewing, and had a couple beers afterwards and slow burn throughout the day, so I can sympathize. I'm not quite piñata level yet, but piñatas are a lot more fun than I remember them being. I think when you're an adult, an inebriated adult, they tend to be a lot of fun. Well, this episode we're going to be talking about base malts. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's wondered how these different certain base malts really they contribute different characteristics, and in my brewing, and I'm assuming you've been here before as well, Matt, where you go out to brew let's say a Pilsner, and you realize that you're all out of Pilsner malt. A lot of us store our malts, we buy in bulk, so you just I'm just going to use some regular Pale 2-row instead, right?
Yep, definitely. I've been right there with you, and I know I hear it all the time, especially like specific styles. Pilsner's a great example, just because I think primarily because it's synonymous with the name. But then things like Scottish ales, like you have supposedly you have to use Golden Promise, or for English styles you have to be using Maris Otter. So yeah. I get it all the time, like specific base malts for specific styles of beer. Totally,
and like I said, the beauty of home brewing is that, or the beauty of brewing in general, really, is that in the end, you're probably going to make beer, but does it really make a difference what base malts you're using? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. But first, I want to thank everybody who's been using our links when shopping online. It's been helping us out a ton. If you're looking for a painless way to help us out, to help us to continue bringing you this show, those links can be found over at brewlosophy.com/support. It may not seem like a big deal to you, but it really does matter to us, and we appreciate everyone who's been doing that. If you want to be rewarded for your support, which is pretty rad, you can become a patron of Brewlosophy by pledging a small monthly contribution. In return, you're going to receive things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, never-before-published recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a very special guest. Coming up later this month, we've got our friends from Imperial Yeast, which is going to be super cool. They're going to be answering questions about yeast and all the other microbiological stuff, really anything else you want to ask them. In the future, we've got Seth Clan from Mecca Great Estate Malt. Ales of the River Wards blogger Ed Coffey is going to be on. The Pope of Foam, Dr. Charlie Bamforth, and of course, Vinny Chilurzo is going to be on, answering questions about hoppy IPA and I'm sure some sour beers. We actually just added a new reward to those who are contributing at the $5 level or higher, and it's pretty cool. What we're going to do is draw names monthly for people to win a gift card, like a gift certificate to Love to Brew. We're partnering with Love to Brew on this. They want to support what it is we're doing, and they're going to do it in that way. So if you're contributing at a $5 level or higher, you are going to be entered into a monthly drawing to win a nice little gift card. We haven't settled on the details yet, but we're going to start that this month. Anyways, you can learn more about how you can be rewarded for helping us out at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Matt, just a little over a week until HomebrewCon starts, and I am as excited as my kids the night before Christmas. How about you, dude? It's gonna be fun.
I can't express to you how excited I am. Like, getting through work these past week or so, and this upcoming week is going to be just a drag. Yeah. I am so excited. I'm kind of just like half prepping myself, trying to get extra sleep, because I know it's going to be just insane once I get there.
Yeah, that's what I was doing last night, was just trying to prepare myself for HomebrewCon. Pickle my liver early. So, well, if you haven't already reserved your spot for our annual karaoke party, there are still a few left. You got to jump on it quickly, though. They're going fast. You can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, for details on making a donation to secure your spot. I haven't really been talking about who all is coming to this thing, so I guess I'll throw out there that we just got confirmation that the dudes from Bootleg Biology as well as Jaded Brewing are going to be there. All the dudes from YakimaValleyHops.com, Mecca Great Estate Malt, Imperial Yeast, we got people from them. They're going to be there. Nico's going to show up from the now defunct, unfortunately, NicoBrew.com. It's going to be a great time. So if you want to hang out with people like us, and you don't have to sing, but it's a lot cooler if you do. Email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com. Again, I'll hook you up with details on making your donation to get on the list early. All right, I know we ran down our schedule in detail last week, but I want to make sure that we get to see all of your beautiful faces in PDX. So here's a slightly more condensed version of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be showing up in Portland on Wednesday, June 27th to set everything up. That evening from 6 p.m. to whenever, we're going to be hanging out with the folks from Imperial Yeast at the Imperial Bottle Shop on Division Street for their Insane in the Yeast Strain event. It's going to be a lot of fun. Totally free. You just have to pay for your beer. And from the looks of it, I think a lot of people are going to be going to that thing. I was checking out their Facebook page for that event, and there's a lot of people already confirmed going. So get there early. Let's see. Thursday, the day the conference starts, we're going to be doing data collection at our booth first thing in the morning, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., right when the expo floor opens. You can come out and lend your palate to our brand of brewing science. And then we're going to be recording Q&A episodes with Yakima Valley Hops, Imperial Yeast, and Mecca Great Estate Malt from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. If you have any questions for those folks or for us, you can come out and ask them live right there at our booth. And then, of course, our karaoke party starts at 9 p.m. and goes to 1 a.m. in the morning at the Trio Club in Portland. We'll be at the kickoff party for about an hour before we have to bounce, head over to our karaoke event that night. On Friday the 29th, we're going to be recording beer reviews with Jersey and Tim starting at 11 a.m. So bring your beer by. We really need it. If you want to see them review some, you can bring your beer by. We'll get you all registered. At 2 o'clock on Friday, Matt, you, me, and Chino are going to be doing It's a Sprint seminar, our talk on brewing beers quickly.
Yep, I can't wait. I'm starting to put some finishing touches just on my notes and trying to think about some of the brews that we've done in the past and thinking about some of the short and shoddy methods that we've been proposing. And it's been amazing just exploring that stuff. Like, I don't know how you've been feeling while putting your notes together, but I love looking at some of the science behind this and some of the things that, we're not really sure why we do things a certain way. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Well, I was the approach that I'm taking to planning, preparing for this seminar is a short and shoddy approach. So basically I haven't done anything on it yet. And I'm just kidding. I have, but that would be funny. Go super meta. And
that would be funny.
And do a short and shoddy seminar, like end 15 minutes into it or something. No, it's going to be a full hour. We're going to have a good time. So as soon as our seminar is over, we're going to head back to our booth and collect more data. All of this, every participant can participate in everything that we're doing because everything is different. We've actually got I think it's 5 different projects that we'll be collecting data for over the weekend. So Saturday, June 30th, the expo floor opens up an hour early. So it opens at 10 a.m. We're going to be collecting even more data starting at 10 o'clock. So come by to participate in that. And then at 12 p.m., we're going to record more beer reviews, assuming there's enough beer to be reviewed. And if not, or regardless, we're going to be hanging at our booth for the rest of the day. So whether you want to ask questions, have your beer reviewed, be a participant, or just hang out with us, please make sure to stop by our booth. It's going to be super cool. We'll also have brand new badass hats and taster glasses for sale, stickers that you can just take and slap all over your guitars and stuff like that. So swing by the booth. All right. Speaking of Imperial Yeast, our booth partners, they're the sponsor of the feedback this week, and we love them for it. If you haven't tried their stuff yet, get on it. Imperial provides brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market, packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch. Brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation with a wide range of ale and lager strains, as well as some funkier stuff. Imperial Yeast is sure to have what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer. Go check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer at imperialyeast.com today.
So our first piece of feedback this week is from listener Eamon, and that's actually all we know about him is we got Eamon. So Eamon wrote in with some insights on something that he said was in our last Brew and A episode. So Eamon notes that listening to episode 40, and you mentioned that you don't see why a keg wouldn't mess with your yeast when discussing fermentation and serving in the same vessel. And I'd like to throw my hat in that cornies are not clean stainless steel, meaning you may have an above average amount of tin, aluminum, and iron around that are not yeast friendly. The upside to this is that you can make sure after you clean your keg with sanitizer to leave water in it overnight, and that should leach or oxidize anything that's exposed. In fact, I generally do this for all my brewing metal accessories, except I use 2% ethanol because I have access to tons of it, and ethanol keeps things clean and may leach materials water doesn't. Of course, this almost definitely doesn't matter, but I thought I'd provide something from the world of anal retentive microbiology.
That's awesome. I'm just going to kind of leave it alone. Amazing. I feel like he's giving a good tip that I can't really comment on.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, and, the anal retentive microbiology is the best kind of microbiology.
Yeah.
It's attention to detail is something, I'm never upset that someone nerds out about something. You know what I mean? Like that's always, I love hearing that stuff, even if it's something I don't know too much about. Someone who clearly like has a great understanding of what they're doing. Eamon, I totally am. I'm not smart enough to comment on the validity of what you said, but obviously, I definitely agree that the quality of stainless steel may have an impact on how we do things for sure. And that, the actual oxide layer is something I've thought about recently when I've been I recently got the new anvils and I passivated that stainless steel before using them. And I'm just starting to wonder, is that totally necessary or how often should that be done again anytime, So yeah, thanks for the note, Eamon. This is fantastic feedback.
For sure. Yeah. So thanks to Eamon for sending in that feedback. We also got some feedback from Steve Baker in regards to our episode on wort boil length. He says, I don't believe the Maillard reaction happens in a regular boil due to conduction, the same reason you can boil water in a paper cup. I do believe in short and shoddy though. He says, I've converted the majority of my brewing over to 30-minute mashes and 30-minute boils. I love the time savings and it has allowed me to brew more often. Man, we are ruining the world of homebrewers, Matt. This is terrible. Steve actually shared some of his score sheets with me from the short and shoddy beers he entered into the NHC this year. An IPA that scored 38.5. That's a pretty doggone good score. And a Schwartz beer that got a 32.5. So not bad at all. Good job on those, Steve. But in regards to his comment on the Maillard reaction happening, whether it doesn't happen because of conduction or whatever, I guess that's sort of what I think as well. It makes sense to me that's why it wouldn't be happening. But Matt, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I've seen arguments back and forth really frequently in online forums and stuff about whether or not the Maillard reaction happens or to what degree it happens. Based on past experience, I think there is at least a darkening reaction that happens. And I'm not sure if that's a combination of the Maillard reaction and maybe some oxygen and maybe just other reactions that are taking place, or if it's all Maillard, or I'm not totally sure. But I've also witnessed, longer boils that don't really have a difference. But it's something I want to look into more. So I'm not sure. I've seen a lot of really good arguments back and forth that have to do with, the pH.
That's what I've heard.
That's not appropriate, or the conduction. And so I think it's something that we should keep exploring.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Thanks, Steve. All right. Well, if you have any show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com, or you can phone it in by calling 951-444-0320. Again, that's 951-444-0320. Now, listen, I don't drink too many big beers. I tend to like those low alcohol Pilsners so that I can keep myself from getting too thirsty. But I certainly do appreciate sipping on an occasional Russian Imperial Stout, which, Matt, I believe is one of your favorite styles, right?
Indeed it is.
Well, homebrewer Phil Rusher made a Russian Imperial Stout that he labeled beautifully and gave to guests at his wedding. He also sent one to me for review.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. Let's drink a beer and review a beer, and it's dark and it's purple and it looks like rutabagas.
It's very creamy on top there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Ooh, there's some strange stuff going on there. Smell your armpit. Re-cleanse your palate.
It doesn't smell it's not that potent.
No, there's not that potent. Not bad.
Yeah, I like this.
The first taste doesn't punch you in the face. It's like, dude, you know what? You get to know me a little bit. You're going to like me.
It's chocolatey.
Yeah, it's just got a hint of easiness.
Yeah, it's not bad.
I think I like it.
It's got nice foam on top.
Critically now, because we don't often like it, so I'm trying to find ways that I don't like it, and I can't find a lot. I kind of like this. Head games!
I do like it.
Tastes like a good beer.
It's got the chocolate taste to it.
Gonna have to go ahead and disagree with you.
Oh, damn. I just don't know.
If it doesn't have juniper, I'll give you that.
Or the oak barrel.
No, it's easy.
It's good. It'd be hard to drink several of these.
Then would you qualify it as a sipping beer?
Yeah, it's a sipping beer. It feels very potent.
So there's not a taste until like you taste it, and then like the taste rolls in afterwards, and it's like, what up, dude? You know you like it. Come on, don't be an a-hole.
I feel my face getting warm again.
I'm gonna say maybe like 7 or 8%.
Yeah, they're probably in the 9s.
Oh, okay, fine. I judge you based on your inability to assess alcohol content by volume. Marshall, what is it?
14.7% alcohol.
So if we add both of ours together,
No way, dude.
Damn.
Holy crap.
it didn't feel that strong.
Okay, well, I'll give it a new review based on that. It does not taste like it's that powerful.
This is a Russian Imperial Stout made by Phil Rusher.
Is it called Collusion?
It's called From Rusher with Love. That's
awesome.
genius, right?
That's
it's
incredible.
amazing. It's amazing.
If you'd have told us that before, we'd have liked it even better. From Rusher with Love.
His last name's Rusher, yeah. He brewed this for his wedding, right? He says, a huge Russian Imperial Stout, once described as so dark, not even light could escape it, brewed on New Year's Day of 2017, so it's over a year old. This beer was intended to be gifted to our closest friends and family in celebration of our wedding on the 5th of March, but we never ended up getting married. I'm just kidding.
Oh, Jesus. I was like, my God, this thing's got history.
No. Everything from the copious amounts of hops and acidic roasted malt grains to the packaging was considered carefully for aging purposes. If aging, then cool. Dark places work best. If not aging, be sure to enjoy with hedonism and a friend or two. Flavors one may perceive include dark chocolate, coffee, vanilla, bourbon, American oak, roasted caramel, and bittersweet stone fruit.
Yeah, that's good.
All but the alcohol
If
content.
Tim and I like dark beers, you know that they're, I mean, not that they're great, then they need our approval, but they definitely appeal to the regular man.
Okay. I got to be honest. The name alone of this beer, From Rusher with Love, was so genius that it made me fall in love with the beer anyways. And then I tasted it, and then I tasted the thing, and it was so delicious. And, you know, again, this thing had, almost a year and a half of age on it. Really well made, rich, warm, dark chocolate, coffee, all the stuff you expect from a good Russian Imperial Stout. No way would I have guessed that it was, that high in ABV, but super good beer. Huge thanks to Phil for sending it in. And of course, congratulations to the Rushers on their wedding. What did you think of that name, dude? I mean, it's just such a...
It's so clever. It works on so many levels. I love it. It's pretty...
I was thinking about it going, and I love stupid puns. I'll admit it. Like, I'm a dad. I like dad jokes.
It's so perfect.
The way that works. I mean, From Rusher with Love, and it's just it means like multi... Anyways, I thought it was one of the more genius beer names that I've heard of. Well, listen, if you want to have your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make or feel like sending into us to be reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. Also, I want to remind people, if you live anywhere near any of us, we'd love to get you involved as a participant. We've got contributors all the way up in Anchorage, Alaska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Corona, California, Atlanta, Georgia, and Fresno, California. Shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I will connect you with the contributor closest to you. All right, we got to give a little love to the folks who makes the show possible. We'll be right back. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. One thing I've always been curious about is the history of the actual malting process. I mean, we know beer is a really old beverage that's been around, well before the advent of malt houses, like actual maltsters and whatnot. What exactly do we know about the history of malting, Matt?
So we actually know quite a bit. At least, we think we do. A lot of the evidence we have is speculative about the history of malting. But as far as we can tell, it's at least been taking place in some capacity for literally thousands of years. I've been reading recently from quite a few sources that the Sumerians actually have the oldest tangible reference we have to the brewing of beer, by which I mean, the use of barley as a sugar source for fermentation. Comparatively speaking, hops are actually super recent in the brewing of beer in terms of our history. And it's actually where our beer ale distinction usually comes from historically. But so I was reading that, and, in some of the early cuneiform tablets, and this is actually, if you're interested in it, there's an excellent article by Peter Damrow titled Sumerian Beer, and in it he notes that we have evidence at least as far back as 3000 BC talking about beer as a centralized part of Sumerian society, and indicating that it was likely present far before the advent of the early stages of writing, just because... He notes that because we have actually administrative records from the Sumerians, like they're organized in that capacity for cuneiform tablets, or technically like proto-cuneiform, but whatever. And we can kind of see that we had barley designated as an ingredient in beer, just because they had words with quotation marks around it, that are never used in any other cereal product. So he actually speculates that this was malt, that this was produced during a controlled germination process and only used in beer, because that's the only thing it's ever an ingredient for. It's harvested, it's shipped, it's sold, but it's only ever used in the production of beer.
So what I'm hearing you say, I don't really understand all of this stuff you're talking about, but basically what I heard was that beer precedes writing, and that from that we can conclude that beer is the reason for civilization. Basically, I'm
willing to take that jump if you are.
I think it's awesome. I remember watching some show on the History Channel or something about like the history of beer in general, and a large focus of it, of course, has got to be on the grain. And in that one, the speculation was that some Egyptian farmers or whatever left a vat of barley that they had been picking or whatever, harvesting, and it rained. Right. They left it out in the field. It rained. That stuff started to sprout up, and then they learned kind of over time that was producing this fermentable sugar. It was converting the starches, and so it's kind of a neat. I think it's pretty rad history for what has ultimately become my favorite drink.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting, and like researching this was some of the most fun I had all week, thinking about some of the extrapolative evidence that we have for the production of malt specifically, and the historical context in which that was was done. So
Right.
it's super fascinating, but it is definitely all speculative. You know,
Right.
we don't have super hard details on a lot of it, but we know it took place all over the world. We know it took place in Egypt. We know it took place in China. So it's happened. You know, it's pretty fantastic.
Well, it's entirely possible also, you know, running down going down kind of the train of thought that I'm having about where malt and beer comes from, that, you know, once these Sumerians learned how to malt, they just kept drinking and decided that it really didn't matter if they wrote it down, you know. That's kind of how I feel. Like when I texted you this morning, I was like, hey, can we record an hour later? There were reasons for that, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's that. And I'm also willing to bet, you know, like when you started brewing, did you take more notes than you take now? Just out of curiosity?
I actually probably did. I don't know. Yeah.
I think I did before I joined Brewlosophy. I think I started off with like extensive notes and then tapered off and was just kind of doing things on how I knew it to be done. And then I started doing Brewlosophy and I had to record stuff more.
Yeah.
But I think I wouldn't take as many notes if I did. So I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's get into a little bit about how malts are made. We're gonna focus on some very specific stuff here, because we could do a 10-hour episode on malting in general. And there's a great book out there, the Malt Book by Brewers Publication by John Mallet. He's from Bell's, I believe, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So pick up that book if you want to learn more about malt. Fascinating information. So Matt, help us to understand a little bit about the basics of how malt is made.
So. At a really, like you mentioned, Marshall, at a really high level, once barley is ready to be made into malt, which is just, you know, after the barley is grown, it's been harvested, it's been transported to the malt house and stored for a bit of time. The barley is steeped in water for several days, and the moisture level is pretty closely monitored. So during that steeping stage, enzymes are activated, and those enzymes start to break down compounds in the grain that release starches. So as we get those starches released, they start to become more plentiful in the malt. And effectively what's happening is the barley is getting itself ready to grow. You know, like it's actually starting to go through its natural growth period.
Right.
So during that steeping is what we would refer to as the germination phase, which germination is just the step at which starch reserves are really opened up. And from a biological perspective, the kernel is just starting to utilize those starch reserves to feed the growing plant.
Right. It's
So
basically
once those
it's basically the gasoline for the plant's growth. I mean, it's where they're getting their carbohydrates and their energy from, in essence.
Yep, exactly. And so while the plant would want to use those sugars and effectively, you know, start growing and kickstart its growth, what we want to do once all those starches are opened up is halt the grain from actually utilizing any of those starches, because we want them for beer.
That's right.
So
way more
that
important.
germination's halted just by drying the grain. So we can retain those starches. So over another period of several hours, the grain is kiln dry at around 180 degrees Fahrenheit until it reaches a specific moisture content and lava bond. So it's at this point in the process that we usually see the tweaking of some of those variables, like the intensity of the heat used or the length of time or even the moisture content, to make different kinds of malts.
Yeah. And again, just to point out, you know, to people listening right now, you talk to any or a number of different maltsters, they're all going to have unique things that they do differently.
Definitely.
You know, I've been talking a lot with Seth Clan lately from, I think it's actually Klon from Mecca Great Estate Malt, and you know, they've got their unique approach that they take to not only just growing the barley, the type of barley that they grow, but like the malting process, and then also the kilning process. So everybody's going to have something different, and that's why we're able to get these unique malts that taste different and impart different characteristics to beer. A couple of the more popular, you know, so you know, I go to the homebrew shop, I pick up a sack of grain, and I usually will see one of two options. Either one is, well, it'll usually just say either it's like a Pilsner malt, or it'll say that it's floor malted. And so there, what is the difference between these two things?
Basically, like we talked about how malting is super, super old, has a lot of historical background. The way we produce malt nowadays is actually incredibly recent in the history of beer. And that's just because obviously the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the onset of like our technological capabilities are growing.
Right.
What floor malted means is basically it's a non-pneumatic process, which means that there's no air being forced through the grain. what happens is after germination, after that period of opening up of starches that we discussed before, grain was actually traditionally put onto a malting floor in a well generation room. So like literally onto a floor, like a large space area. And since there was no airflow, we actually relied on manually turning that grain to release the heat and the CO2.
Right.
That takes place. So grain was put into these small heaps, essentially to build up a certain amount of heat to keep germination active. And floor germination period was typically about 10 days. It could last a little longer. But the germination grain was then kilned, and we couldn't really air dry that grain because if you air dried it, the moisture levels would never get low enough to keep the grain from spoiling.
Right.
So what floor malting is actually a reference to a historical process in which the grain is germinated on a malting floor.
And the opposite of that would be, I guess we don't call it anything specifically, I think, as brewers or whatever, but it's really like a pneumatic malting process then.
Correct. So what happens is after around 1873, a French innovator named Nicolas Galland created something called he called it a pneumatic germination box, but he said it in French. But he used an air-cooled box that utilized ice and water to keep air flowing through the germination box. Now, with that additional access to oxygen, germination actually happened faster and more completely. Because when you had, heaps of grain on a germination floor, during that period, like I mentioned, the heat's generated, there's CO2 that's pressed out. They don't really have great access to oxygen.
Yeah.
So because he created that box that allowed greater access to oxygen and air was forced through the grain, germination was faster and more complete. But unfortunately, that box didn't really allow for the turning of grain that we mentioned earlier. Like you need to keep it, you need to manually turn the grain in floor malting. Same case with this pneumatic system that he had. And the grain often actually grew rootlets and started to obstruct more of the airflow that way. So he did away with the box. Galland had an assistant named Alphonse Saladin, and he invented a series of essentially what we would call an auger, but it was a series of screw turners that lifted grain from the bottom of the box to the top, which allowed it to automatically be turned at a consistent rate.
Nice.
So we actually credit Saladin with the creation of what we practice today. And like you mentioned, we actually don't really have a name for it because it is the most widely used practice, is to have pneumatic system that forces air through the grain and uses a series of augers or uses a mechanical system to manually turn the grain during the germination phase.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool.
So there you go.
Yeah, I've been. Thanks for the history lesson, by the way, there, Matt. That's super interesting stuff to me. Yeah, I've got some Mecca Great Estate Malt out in my garage, and I believe on their bags they put something like mechanically floor malted or something like that. And now I'm curious. Seth is going to be on our livecast Q&A in I believe next month, actually answering questions of patrons. And I'm going to ask him all about this stuff because I'm super interested to know.
Definitely.
Well, okay. So this episode, the focus of this episode is going to be primarily on base malts. Let's talk a little bit about, let's kind of distinguish base malts from just, regular old malts.
So when we use the word base malt, at least in brewing, like what we typically mean is it's a malt that's used for the base of the grist. And it kind of means two things. The first is that it contributes the majority of sugars. And beer is usually defined that way. Like how many of those sugars come from maltose or come from malt. And that base grist is you would call it a non-specialty malt, but all of it's like gray distinctions anyways.
Yeah.
But it provides the majority of your fermentable sugars, and it's typically lightly colored, not too aggressively expressive, but obviously we have a varying range of character and expressiveness in those base malts. And that leads us to the second part of that definition, is the base malt is actually what you said earlier. It's a bit of the canvas that you build the rest of the beer on.
That's how I view it, and it's interesting to me. I've thought about the kind of origin of these different base malts and how they were driven a little bit perhaps by water chemistry, which is something we talked about a little bit last week's episode, the water chemistry of the region in which these beers were being brewed. And I'm I'm talking about like the level of kilning and whatnot. Yeah. So it seems like, when it comes to base malts, now I want to real quick just say something. We've got in the world of base malts, we're going to talk about these, the main ones: Pilsner malt, Pale Two-Row, Pale Ale malt, Maris Otter, Golden Promise, stuff like that. People often neglect Vienna malt and Munich malt, and we don't mean to do that in this episode. We are not going to focus on those in this episode, but they are base malts and can be used up to 100% of the grist. I've done it, and it works great. But those are kind of at the darker end of the range, and we're going to reserve a whole episode just for those ones. So, but Matt, we have a couple different ways of defining base malts, right?
We do, definitely. And you actually touched on some of them. And it's a little interesting just because we're somewhat inconsistent in the way in which we've labeled some of these malts.
Oh, Lord, yes.
Not to say that it's totally arbitrary. So like we have something like, you mentioned 2-row or 6-row, both pale malts. And we actually label those based off of the number of rows of kernels that you can see on the head of barley. Yeah. So you have, 6-row because that's actually what it looks like. That's how many rows of barley are on the head.
I think the issue, the slight controversy, and in my opinion, it's a silly one when there's controversy for beer or whatever. But the issue is that almost every malt used out there, whether you're making roasted barley or if you're making pale ale malt or whatever, it's almost all 2-row malt. It's almost all 2-row barley. So the problem is that some people get kind of hung up. They don't like that we've turned the word or the term 2-row. It really, when people say that, what they're referring to is pale 2-row. They're referring to just standard pale malt, because everything is 2-row. I get it. I don't care if people call it 2-row, but there are people out there who don't seem to like that very much. For the purposes of this show, if we say 2-row, we're just talking about pale malt. Okay?
Definitely. And it's actually somewhat interesting just because like another way, so like you mentioned, like everything is essentially 2-row. And while a lot of it is 2-row, we also name some of our malts just based off of the heritage variety of barley, or like what variety of barley is being grown. Maris Otter is a perfect example of that, which it is actually just Otter is the variety of barley and Maris is the name of the company.
Yeah, I read a really interesting this article on naming conventions of European, or I think it was just actually British. The malts that come out of the UK and how it's kind of an interesting naming convention and how they were able to do that. But Maris Otter is one of those that's what we call the barley malt. It's that there's no, and that's the problem, is that unless you're growing this specific barley, then you can't call it Maris Otter, even if you kiln it in the same way that barley is kilned.
Exactly. And it's there's, we do that for other grains too. There's a lot of professional brewers I've worked with who, they want a specific season of barley,
right,
or they want a specific kind of barley and season. So we judge a lot based off of the actual variety of barley and the season in which it's grown. But we don't necessarily name all of them that way. We would still call that something like a pale ale malt.
Exactly.
And that actually is based off of, the level of kilning, like you mentioned earlier. We have something like a Pilsner malt that's typically going to be a lower in lava bond and have a different flavor profile than something like a pale ale malt. So those different levels of kilning and those different moisture contents lead to different characters being contributed to the beer from that base malt.
Yeah, it's interesting, and in order of level of kilning, if we're gonna look at malts on a spectrum from lightest to darkest, you've got your Pilsner malts, which can come in Belgian and German varieties. There's Canadian varieties. There's American, or what we call domestic here in the U.S. Varieties, and those are going to typically be 1.5 to about 3 degrees Lovibond, I think. And then they're really light in color. They're said to impart characteristics of like white bread, maybe bread crust, really clean in flavor, crisp, and ultimately, in my opinion, it's like the whitest canvas that you're going to get.
Yep, definitely. It's going to be, it's definitely going to have some flavor to it. Like we see a lot of beers that are 100% Pils malt, but they're going to be really light, and they're going to be used in just a wide variety of styles because of that. Like a lot of lagers are going to use Pilsner malt, or they use lager malt.
Yeah.
They'll have like a lager malt or a Pilsner malt, and that's going to be used in things all the way from, Pilsners to Belgian Golden Strongs to Belgian Dark Strongs and all of those in between. So
definitely. And then right after that, you've got your pale malts, and I want to distinguish those from pale ale malts. What's the difference between a pale malt and a pale ale malt?
So a pale ale malt is actually a few degrees lava bond darker than a pale malt, and it is supposed to contribute like additional bready characters, so more of that bread crust toast character. You're starting to get a little darker in the lava bond range,
Right.
And it's supposed to be maybe a little more full. I'm not so sure on all of those, but essentially the difference is you're talking about a darker pale malt.
Yeah, so pale malts in general, we've already spent some time talking about the 6-row, 2-row distinction. A little bit darker than a Pilsner malt, American pale ales, your blonde ales, stuff like that, you're going to use a pale malt. Pale ale malt, what I've been told, think of pale ale malts as kind of an American version of a kind of a copy of Maris Otter, kind of going for that more biscuity flavor. Yep. And that's what Maris Otter is said to do, not just because of the variety, but also the way in which they're kilned. So Maris Otter's it's going to be about as dark as a pale ale malt, but at the same time imparts more of a nutty, biscuity kind of darker bread crust characteristic to beer.
Yep. And then you have things like Golden Promise. So associated with Scottish brewing, kind of in the same way that Maris Otter is associated with English brewing. But Golden Promise is supposed to be a lot more mellow, like pretty sweet, really, really clean, 2-ish lava bond, closer to a pale malt than a pale ale malt. And it's actually pretty interesting. Like I haven't seen a lot of people using Golden Promise commercially for Scottish beers recently. It's a lot of Maris Otter. Maris Otter tends to be more disease resistant than Golden Promise, but it's definitely out there, and there's a lot of varieties of base malt in terms of what they can contribute. Maris Otter and Golden Promise, interestingly, seem to be kind of gaining popularity among brewers of this hazy New England IPA. And I think a part of that, I actually made a New England IPA. It was all Maris Otter and flaked oats. That was it. It was the first one I ever made, probably the best one I've made. And I think the idea is that you're not looking to make a super malty, malt forward beer, but you want to have that background characteristic to balance out all of that hop juicy character. And I hear people talking about Maris Otter and Golden Promise. I've never actually used Golden Promise ever in the hundreds of batches of beer that I've made. I've never used Golden Promise, which is weird. Yeah, that is weird. I think there's definitely, like, I'm not a big user of Vienna typically. And I know we're not going to talk too much about that, but I've been using Maris Otter more in my Scottish ales recently, and I think it's turning out perfect. So
I love Maris Otter. Again, we mentioned already that Vienna and Munich are also base malts. Don't leave those behind. You can also use wheat, malted wheat. You can use it 100% of the grist and get your nice hazy Hefeweizens done that way. So like I mentioned earlier, I've been known to swap in Pils malt for pale malt and standard ales, skip out on Maris Otter when I didn't feel like spending the cash on a sack. Did it make a difference? That's what we aim to find out with some experiments that we performed. Results when we return. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewers Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
There are a number of different base malts available to brewers these days, ranging in color and ostensibly flavor contribution. I'd reckon the two most popular malts used, at least by American brewers, are domestic pale two-row, so the lighter of the two pale malts, and Pilsner malt, which, as we discussed earlier, aren't terribly different. To test this out, contributor Jake Houlihan brewed up a couple American pale lagers for an experiment, and each of so both of them use 95.5% of either pale two-row or Pilsner malt. He, in addition to make up the rest of the grist, was 4% acid malt and then 0.5% of black prinz, because he does that for color adjustment. Surprising to me, the OGs of these two beers came out exactly the same, 1052. The reason that surprises me is because in my brewing, over years and years of brewing, for some reason, it always seemed that when I was making a beer with a high degree of, or a high amount of Pilsner malt, that I would always get better efficiency, better conversion compared to two-row. Have you ever experienced that, Matt?
No, I have. Absolutely. I definitely have always noticed better efficiency with Pils malt, for sure.
Well, and what's interesting, again, in this one is he didn't notice anything like that. Both the beers, or both the worts, ended with the same exact 1052 OG. So he's just a better brewer than me and you too, Matt.
I knew that already.
Yeah, duh, exactly. All right, so he treated these beers identically, otherwise, other than the malt that was used, the base malt that was used. And when they were done, he served them to 22 participants, which would require 12 people to get it right in order for us to say that it was significant, but only 8 did. So just barely over 1/3, meaning that these beers were not reliably distinguishable. People could not tell them apart with any consistency. Pretty interesting to me, given how much I think focus brewers have on brewing with the right grains for the style.
Definitely. And I think what's surprising to me from this one is, I'm a little less surprised by, two-row and Pils are fairly close in lava bond,
right.
Obviously some different production, but I would think that based on, the length of the boil and stuff like that, Pils and two-row would express things different chemically.
Right.
So that they would then, that you'd be able to discern that. Now, not to say that there isn't still a chemical difference, which I guarantee there is because they're made differently, but it's definitely surprising to me that wasn't in such a capacity that people were reliably able to pick it out.
Yeah, me too. I mean, and I've been, I'm the guy who will get hung up. It's just my neurotic way of thinking. If I'm making a Pilsner and, in my head, even if I have to sub in pale malt, I'm still thinking, well, it's just not going to be Pilsnery now, and then of course I'll make that,
right.
Of course I'll make the beer. And then when I'm tasting it, I'm like, well, it doesn't taste like a real Pilsner. But our minds are very interesting when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so this experiment, the results of this one were pretty interesting to me. To follow up on this one, and Malcolm actually did a comparison between Maris Otter and pale two-row.
He did one that was just a little bit darker. So obviously, like we mentioned before, Maris Otter being sort of a English pale ale malt variety, or I guess it's maybe more fair to say that pale ale is the American attempt at Maris Otter.
There you go.
But he ended up making an English bitter, which was had quite a few malts in it. It was about 91.5, either pale malt, so two-row, or Maris Otter. He uses that 3.5 red malt. 2.5% Cariston malt, which is a crystal malt, 2% C120L, so that Crystal 120, and then 0.5% Special Roast. So a little bit more malt complexity going on in this one. But that's a classic Malcolm recipe. So he did this. Malcolm did this. And actually, Maris Otter did end up having a higher OG at 1056 as opposed to the 2-row 1055. So very small difference between those. Between those, nothing I would wager too much on. That difference was also reflected in the final gravity. It was 1015 versus 1014. Respectively. So the one that started one higher, the Maris Otter beer, did end up finishing 0.001 higher as well.
So same attenuation basically, and similar ABV. I mean, these beers were, for all intents and purposes, about the same, with the exception of those two malts that were the base malts that were used.
Definitely, and Malcolm's a big believer, I know, in getting very large sample sizes for some of these. So we had 47 participants, which is fantastic. And at that sample size, we would need 22 people to reliably select the beer out to say it was significant. And he ended up having 25 people correctly answer this one.
Right.
So it looks like a beer made with 2-row versus Maris Otter ended up being significant.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this one, there are a few experiments where I go in with an expectation, but I've been so convinced that Maris Otter, I've been so convinced though that Maris Otter has an impact, has like a distinguishable, noticeable impact on the beers that I make using it. Like I said, that New England IPA that I made with Maris Otter, I liked it better than the subsequent New England IPAs that I've made just using Pale 2-row. And to me, I get exactly what, everyone else, and this could be biased, but kind of says that you're supposed to get from Maris Otter, that nice, rich, biscuity, kind of a warming, perception of like a warm biscuit in my mouth type of thing. And so I'm going to, for my English beers, and to be honest, for a lot of my American style beers, I still prefer using a Maris Otter type grain for it. And these results validate my decision there. So it makes me feel pretty good. How about you, Matt?
No, definitely. I use Maris Otter all the time. I've actually been on a kick recently where I've been using a blend from Muttons, which is it's a blend of their Maris Otter and their Propino, which is their pale ale malt. And that is money. It is fantastic.
Awesome.
But I definitely use Maris Otter all the time. It's one of my favorite base malts. I would keep it on hand all the time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and that's the thing is you get that, like Malcolm said in his impressions on this, he thought the Maris Otter beer was slightly sweeter. And for some reason he thought it had like a stronger mineral characteristic to it.
That was weird.
Yeah, that is weird. I mean, he's the the national beer judge or whatever. So I trust that he's accurate on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting. He noted the 2-row is actually seeming more English in that experiment. So I thought that was pretty interesting that, like based on these ingredients, we might assume that like, oh, that English character is coming from that Maris Otter. And maybe in some ways it might, but in other ways it looks like in this particular beer, like the layers were there with the 2-row beer to give off what Malcolm wanted from the English style.
Yeah.
So that was fantastic. And so now we've got 2 experiments under the belt where it's one that has come back not significant, which is obviously Jake's 2-row versus Pils, one that is significant, the MO versus 2-row. And so really recently, Jake has been making a lot of lagers, and he was interested in this 2-row versus 6-row. And 6-row is something we don't see used almost ever. It's actually really famously just used in big beer, like in American light lagers. And that's, I think, primarily because 6-row is more enzymatic than 2-row. It's able to work with adjuncts a bit better, like flaked rice. So Jake ended up doing a lager, 100% base malt, which is the way I like to see it done.
That's right.
With 2-row versus 6-row. And ultimately, he actually had a higher OG in the 2-row wort, which was 1042 versus 1040.
Which is expected, right? I mean, that's so the 6-row malt is going to have the ability, I guess a stronger ability or better ability to enzymatically convert starches from other adjuncts into fermentable sugars. But the 2-row, and the reason we see 2-row being used so often, I think, in part, is because it just overall better mash conversion.
Yep, definitely. So ultimately, he ended up having a closer FG in those two. So the final gravity ended up being 1011 in the 2-row beer and 1010 in the 6-row beer. So a little attenuated, a little bit better, but still roughly the same.
Yeah.
And at Jake's sample size, he would have needed 11 people to respond correctly to his survey in order to say that, we could reliably distinguish these beers from one another. And 12 people ultimately ended up saying, having the correct answer.
Yeah.
So we can say that a beer made or an American lager with 2-row versus 6-row ended up being distinguishable.
Yeah, this one was really fascinating to me. The fact that 12 out of 20 participants, so over half, and one more than we actually needed to say it was significant, were able to reliably, to identify the odd beer out. And Jake was telling me that some of them were just super confident and able to nail it like right off the bat. That's really interesting. 6-row malt is another one of those ingredients that, again, I've never used. I've never even had interest in using it. And so to see, to have Jake do this, I was like, man, this is really interesting. And a part of me just didn't expect it to really matter. Again, I just assumed in my head, I was like, that it's just the rows on the barley stalk. Why would that
definitely
make a difference?
I mean, I kind of felt the same way. I've only used 6-row really once, back in there's a Brew United competition where, you had to use so much of a certain kind of malt for a certain beer.
Yeah.
And I ended up using 6-row in an American light lager, and I didn't really get anything in that beer that I thought was, noticeably, oh, that must be 6-row. You know what I mean? So, but it's actually pretty interesting that based off the people who responded to Jake's survey and got it correct, preference was pretty split.
Yeah.
4 tasters preferred each beer. And then 3 people just didn't have a preference. And one person ultimately said that, he didn't really notice the difference in the beers at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was kind of Jake's impression that the 6-row, I think he said it was dirtier.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting way to explain it, because he also mentioned liking both. He preferred the 2-row beer. He noted that it was, had a richer malt character. He said it was more sweet, more what he was looking for.
Right.
But 6-row is what we would consider to maybe be a little huskier in character, maybe a little more raw in that capacity. But people had a split preference. It was super interesting.
When I was a kid, I had to wear like husky sized jeans. That's what you made me
I still have to wear husky size jeans.
No, you don't.
What are you?
Anyways, back to beer and away from our husky statures. Jake's comment that the 6-row had and he didn't say, I was talking to him like, what do you mean by dirty? He was like, it's not, when what I thought of was like when you use Fuggles, there's this really earthy kind of, I think husky's probably a good, that grain husk, real grainy characteristic. And I've heard 6-row described before as just being really grainy, whereas most 2-row pale malts or 2-row Pilsner malts do have kind of they're known for their sweetness. That's why we use them really, for that flavor contribution. So really interesting results on that one as well. 2-row does seem to produce a beer with a distinguishable characteristic from 6-row. So for you, Matt, what does this all mean when you put these results together? What do you make of them?
I definitely pay a ton of attention now to what kind of malts I'm using, especially, and not especially base malts, but definitely base malts. And I think if anything, like I've walked away from this thinking that, like specific base malts may not necessarily be necessary for specific styles. I think that we treat these base malts as like, oh, well, you have to use Golden Promise for your Scottish brewing. I think that we need to start maybe shifting the way we think about it a little bit to other kinds of like how we think about specialty malts, like what character are you going for?
Right.
And trying to like get that out of it. But I for sure think that this has impacted my brewing. I am pretty specific about the base malts that I'm using now, contextually to the beer I'm going for. So, they're such a foundation for building the beer. It's up there.
No, I'm with you. If I'm making a Pilsner, right now, so I've been using Mecca Great Estate malts a lot lately. And they've got their La Manta and they've got their Pelton, and those are their 2 main base malts. I find myself using Pelton I believe that's their Pilsner style malt, or their lager malt. And I might be mixing it up with the La Manta, but I use the ones that are meant for it. And a part of it for me is that when I make, for example, if I'm making a Pilsner, I expect it to be, yellow, that color. And I accomplish that using a lower kilned malt, whether it has a huge impact on a flavor, which in my experience, especially with the Mecca malts, and again, every maltster is going to have their different approach. And, but I found with these smaller maltsters, they really make an effort, it seems at least, to produce malts that have very specific and characteristics that really do line up with that particular malt. So I'm definitely in the camp, regardless of the results, of trying to at least stick with the style appropriate malt. But at the same time, if I do run out of, say, Maris Otter, or if I'm out of my pale malt of choice, but I got a whole bunch of lager malt, I'll use that for a pale ale or an IPA any day of the week. Doesn't bother me one bit. I might balance it out with maybe a little bit more character, or character malts, or even toss in some Munich malt to try to bump up that color contribution and maybe some of that bready, malty flavor characteristics that I expect from a darker malt like a Maris Otter.
Yeah, totally. I think that makes tons of sense. And, I think the blending of base malts and like talking about, what color you do want to get out of it. And also, like, I think you made a great point, like, thinking about, think about the beer that you're brewing and the resources you have at hand, and plan appropriately. Just tweak and adjust, and do what you got to do to get a beer out of it. I think it's going to work out. Totally.
I mean, you're going to make beer at the end of the day. Something that I think has been fun. And again, we haven't touched too much on Vienna and Munich malt as base malts, but swapping in, say, 50% of a simple, Pilsner malt grist with Vienna malt or something like that, you can really get some interesting flavors and characteristics out of something like that. I think finally, just if I'm going to give any bit of advice, there are people out there who just really like to stick with traditions. So, and this, I'm kind of thinking about the 2-row versus 6-row thing. If you're making, an American light lager or an American premium lager for that matter, maybe go with 6-row malt, because that's what's used for it. And maybe you do get something out of it, even if it's not totally noticeable. You still get that kind of that romance. You get that the knowledge of knowing that you're doing it the way that it was originally done. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what's wonderful about this hobby, I think.
Totally agreed.
Well, Matt, do you have anything else on base malts that you want to talk about?
Man, as always, I have a lot I'd like to talk about, but I think we're going to save it. If anyone has anything they'd like to contribute to the discussion, I'd love to hear about it. This is definitely something I think we want to keep exploring.
Absolutely. And don't forget to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/brewlosophy. We are going to be having Seth Klon from Mecca Grade Estate Malt on answering questions very soon. To read about the experiments we discussed in this episode and all of the other crazy stuff we're up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.